Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us this evening, everyone. Yes, I am Kevin Baker, the director of the New York City chapter of the Living New Deal. Just to let you know who we are and where we are coming from, as the kids refuse to say anymore, our nonprofit endeavor evolved out of an effort by a team of scholars centered in Berkeley to map the sites and accomplishments of the New Deal in California. 18 years later, we are a national organization with an archive of over 19,000 New Deal sites and counting, mapped on an easily usable electronic map on our website, livingnewdeal.org. Even I can use it, which should tell you how easy it is. We provide information on all sources having to do with the New Deal, including books, artworks, films, videos, lectures, tours, and educational programs, such as this webinar, and even produce these beautiful, handy pocket maps of New Deal sites in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York. As you can see here, here's a New York example. Uh, easily available on our website, livingnewdeal.org. We support the legacy of the New Deal, not only the enormous contributions that it made to American life, but also how those contributions might be continued today and into the future. Tonight, our program entitled The Next Crash, a subject that has become much more topical, unfortunately, than we ever intended, involves a pair of Supreme Court decisions handed down almost a year ago, near the end of June 2024, that may have gutted what the right wing likes to call the regulatory state, and the rest of us try to call America. While they received little news coverage at the time, these decisions, called earth-shattering by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and a massive shock to the legal system by Justice Elena Kagan, have jeopardized the ability of the federal government to effectively oversee almost anything, including our financial markets. Here to discuss them with me tonight are, fortunately, two people much smarter than I am. Diana B. Henriques is a longtime financial journalist and author whose most recent history, Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate American Capitalism. Here it is. Uh, was a Living New Deal finalist for Book of the Year in 1923. Her other recent works have included A First Class Catastrophe, The Road to Black Monday, The Worst Day in Wall Street History, and The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, which was made into an HBO movie starring Robert De Niro and Michelle Pfeiffer. I bet Bernie Madoff had never dreamed that he was going to be played by Robert De Niro someday. Dr. Noah A. Rosenblum is an associate professor of law at New York University with a PhD in history from Columbia and a JD from Yale. He has written extensively on administrative law, constitutional law, and legal history, including the recent law review articles on the making of presidential administration and the anti-fascist roots of presidential administration. I wish I could hold up the internet to show you his works there, but they are free to read and easily accessible on his NYU Law website. We'll have that posted on our site today, too. Taking a cue from that sometime ally of the New Deal, John L. Lewis, who said, "He who tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted." I am the author, most recently, of The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of a New City from Canop. All right, to get started, and just to repeat, there will be time to answer questions at the end, so send them in if you have them. Um, Noah, if you could give us a quick summary, a quick rundown of the two cases in question, which are Jarkissi and Loper Bright Industries. If you could tell us what happened there.
Happily. And thank you, Kevin, for having me on. Diana, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And it's delightful to see so many people excited about the history of the New Deal. So, as Kevin just suggested, last term there were several major cases about administrative law, and two of them are of interest to us right now. So, the first, Jarkissi, begins as a kind of boring securities enforcement. You've got a guy, he's a right wing talk show host, I think, and he engages in some garden variety securities fraud. And under a statute that allowed the SEC to prosecute garden variety securities fraud, they could either drag a fraudster to court or they could pursue a fraudster in their own administrative law courts in front of an administrative law judge. And that distinction turns out to be critical. They go after Jarkissi in front of an administrative law judge, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a truly unexpected, unprecedented, shocking ruling, said that it was unconstitutional to allow the SEC to prosecute Jarkissi in an administrative law court because it violated a number of constitutional rights, in particular, a right to a jury trial. Okay, that's very technical. What does it really mean? It restricts the ability of administrative agencies like the Securities Exchange Commission to enforce their laws in an expeditious manner by going in front of administrative law judges. And instead, it requires them to go to federal court. Now, that's a terrible decision on its own. It gets even worse when you combine it with some of the other anti-administrative decisions coming out of the Supreme Court. The one that most people focus on is called Loper-Bright. It's actually two cases, but only my law students need to know that. The critical thing about that case, it involves whether these fishermen have to pay for monitors on their own boats. But from a legal perspective, the case is about who gets to interpret ambiguous provisions in statutes. So from, I don't know when you want to start counting, but at least until Loper-Bright was decided, it was widely understood that if a statute was ambiguous, that was one of the ways that the legislature delegated to the agency the power to interpret the statute and fill in the meaning of the ambiguous term. And the case that stands most explicitly for that proposition is called Chevron. In Loper-Bright, again, in this way that was kind of unexpected and without a lot of legal foundation, the Supreme Court ruled that the Chevron case had been wrongly decided. In this case, they said it was wrongly decided as a matter of statute instead or as a matter of constitutional law. We can talk more about that if you want during the Q&A. But the key point is that it prevented the agency from interpreting ambiguous statutes on its own and is now giving that power to courts. So in both of these cases, sorry for going on so long, Kevin. Both of these cases, we see the same thing happening, which is we see the Supreme Court take power that used to belong to an agency and that in modern America, we had always assumed belonged to agencies and helped give agencies the power to regulate and take that power and move it over to the judiciary.
Yeah, which is kind of amazing. No, that was a great summary, Noah. And just to get a couple of things, a little background here. Now that the Chevron deference, as it was called, was cited 18,000 times in 40 years, from what I read, and that's simply overturned in the space of this one case, and and it wasn't like they had no alternatives. The Brennan Center for Justice claims that 30% of all legal challenges to agency rulings are upheld in any case. And then the biggest irony of all this is that the Chevron deference was made a precedent in 1984 in favor a ruling by the Berger Court in favor of the Reagan administration, which was being sued by the National Resources Defense Council. So this was a law that had been established to uphold a Reagan agency under this right-wing radical Ann Gorsuch, who was the head of the EPA, saying, it's up to you to interpret these statutes, and suddenly that's thrown out in just this one case here. which
Yeah, it's a story
stunning.
full of no, it's absolutely. It's a story
Yeah.
that's full of ironies, and you flagged one of them, which I like to point out to my students, that someone like Nino Scalia, Justice Scalia, he was a big Chevron supporter for a lot of reasons, probably related to the fact, maybe two, one that he was an administrative law professor himself, so he understood how important a doctrine like that is from an institutional perspective, but also because if you think about the United States in the second half of the 20th century, the Republicans pretty rarely control Congress, but they are able to occasionally win the presidency. And so a doctrine like Chevron was understood to delegate power to the agencies that were in turn in some ways responsive to the president at the expense of other actors. And in the Chevron case itself, like you just said, it was about allowing the Environmental Protection Agency to change the rules in a way that made them less protective of the environment as opposed to more. So that's one irony. There's another irony, which is that the Loper-Bright case itself involves a statute that is often thought to be one in which the agency is actually in the pocket of industry. So the idea that that statute was in some sense so oppressive of American small business that the court needed to step in to right the wrong of oppressive bureaucrats. Particularly funny if you think of that being the statute in which they had to do this. I guess the last irony that really sticks with me is that, so Chevron, as you mentioned, was the most cited case in administrative law, was cited thousands of times. But in a more basic sense, the whole idea of administrative government, and I know we're going to get into this more over the hour, so I won't go too deep, but it really was about trying to find ways for government to be more responsive. And it could be if the only way it operated was to operate through heavy-handed statutes or through unpredictable generalist judges, and not to be a shill for capitalism. But nobody wants that more than big industry. Because if you're big industry and your only two options are, expert regulators who understand your business and have some power to regulate you, or heavy-handed legislators and random generalist judges who make decisions based on Lord knows what consideration, right? In one case, you're at the mercy of whatever the press happens to get people riled up about. And in the other, you've got predictable regulation that can lead to well-functioning markets that you can price in.
And so here we have the party which claims to despise excessive litigation, claims to despise activist justices, going ahead and saying that without, I'm sorry, this claims to despise activist justices, saying that everything now has to go to trial if that will kill regulations. So that's the way to do it, by just making everything so expensive, so litigious, so long lasting that this becomes the problem. Diana, in the case of our financial markets, these attempts at reform go back even much further, go back to the 1930s, right? And that was an enormous ongoing battle, as you detail brilliantly in Taming the Street, about to try to exert some control over Wall Street, which had never really been reined in, or barely reined in, by the federal government before. It was really like a 6-year battle, wasn't it?
It was, and of course, it was a battle of constant resistance. You're right, there had been some form of business regulation that predated the New Deal. The Federal Trade Commission, the creation of the Federal Reserve to some degree was a restraint on business. But neither of those really hit Wall Street in its pocketbook the way the proposals of the New Deal did. And I think it's important to note that during the campaign in 1932, there were a number of financial scandals, actually, starting with the great collapse of the Bank of the United States in December 1930, and then moving through the collapse of Samuel Insull's utility behemoth in the spring of 32. And that this had put these, what Teddy Roosevelt called malefactors of great wealth, had put them front and center in the headlines on the front pages. And Franklin Roosevelt was very responsive to that. Actually, we can see in one of the first speeches he gave after Insull's collapse that he had edited in himself a long
Mhm.
passage about the importance of regulating these gigantic utility pyramids, which, just for modern context, the power utilities, the gas and electric utilities of the 1920s and early 30s were the Silicon Valley of that day's economy. They determined who prospered, which sections of the country could attract industry, where it was safe and easier to live. So where the power lines ran, wealth and prosperity could run. And so the control of these public utilities was a huge priority of Roosevelt's, and one that we don't perhaps appreciate as much today. So yes, it was a 6-year battle. He really began in earnest with the 100 Days in 1933. The last of his great reforms were the Mutual Fund Regulatory Acts of 1940, which have given us one of the best regulated mutual fund industries in the world, and have made Wall Street investment safe and liquid and professionally guided for billions and billions of ordinary Americans. So that 1933 to 1940 period brought us this amazing list of financial reforms.
Yeah, if you'll, and you have, we have a slide
I did prepare a
with
brief
that list here.
summary.
Okay,
of,
yeah, if we can see those, this is what's passed in the space of 7 years. Let's see. Is it coming up there?
I think we're there. You were getting it. Many of them have just become, ordinary household material for us.
This is. Let's see. Is it on there? Anyway, but these were amazing reforms, as you say. Utilities just didn't run to a lot of the country. We really, I mean, the country.
No, I mean, they're only 90. Tiny.
There we are. There it is.
Great. A tiny fraction of the nation's farms, and of course, farming was an enormous industry sector, economic sector at the time, and fewer than 10% of the nation's farms had electricity. And think what that meant. That meant no way to pump water. That meant no light after dark. That meant no way. I mean, the idea of even milking machines or anything like that were just out of reach. And the smart utilities knew that you didn't make money running lines out hundreds of miles distant farm. You made money in compact suburban and urban areas where you could be the monopoly supplier. So they wanted, in effect, Kevin, they wanted electricity to be a luxury good. Not a commodity. They wanted it to be a luxury good that the wealthy could enjoy, and that they could get rich on. And the power and wealth of the utility industry during the 20s and early 30s is quite amazing. There was a huge Federal Trade Commission investigation of the industry. We see here the other scope of that financial reform. The bank management rules, of course, helped unfreeze the paralysis in the banking system that Roosevelt inherited on Inauguration Day. There wasn't a functioning bank in the country. Every state had at least restricted withdrawals or actually shut its banks. The bank deposit insurance, what we now know as the FDIC, came in the same package. Honest investment disclosure, the 33 Act, came in the same 100 days. Following in the next year was the Securities and Exchange Commission's creation. 35 saw the utility industry reform with the Public Utility Holding Company Act. 1938 was the Maloney Act, which gave us the origins of the NASD and the current self-regulatory structure we live with to this day in the OTC market.
Over-the-counter market, in
the over-the-counter stock market. 38 and 39 saw a series of arcane but quite important bankruptcy, trust department, and audit reforms. And then, as I mentioned, those landmark rules for mutual funds in 1940. So as a package, this set of reforms that I focus on in Taming the Street was a revolution for ordinary Americans and their ability to participate in the world of capitalism.
Yeah, it was really making America safe for capitalism.
Well, making capitalism safe for America.
And the point, in the FDIC, before that, people were, even in the good times, bank failures were just routine. I mean,
They
hundreds a
were.
year, right? Yeah, I
There
think
were,
people.
and when they fail, 9 times out of 10, I mean, occasionally you'd get really lucky. It was a crapshoot, but
Yeah,
occasionally some other big neighborhood bank would buy up your bank. And after weeks or months, you
yeah,
could get
yeah,
your money. But the more common outcome was the money was gone. I mean,
yeah,
your nest egg was gone. I mean, the number, of course, bank failures accelerated in the Great Depression to
yes,
just a disastrous level. And Roosevelt would talk in his speeches about how Americans had lost billions. In fact, one of the most poignant cartoons from this
hmm,
period, which I just love, showed a shabby man in a once nice suit sitting on a park
oh
bench.
yeah,
Remember? And
yeah,
there's a little squirrel, a little thrifty squirrel with his little nuts. Well, why didn't you save up for the hard times in the
yeah,
in the good days? And the guy is holding a tabloid paper that says bank failures, and he looks at the squirrel and he said,
hmm.
I did
Yeah,
fail."
yeah,
So people who had saved for a rainy day found that their banks failed and they were wiped out, and then the
yeah,
deluge came. So the
yeah,
bank failures, the importance of the creation of the FDIC, which Roosevelt opposed initially, he
right,
had to be arm twisted
right.
into adding that to the banking legislation. And the person we can thank for him doing that was Representative Herbert Stiegel of the
Ah, the
Glass-Steagall Act.
Glass-Steagall Act, yeah,
Yes, the
and
Glass-Steagall Act.
well,
I mean, Stiegel was convinced that the day Herbert Hoover walked out of the White House and announced deposit insurance, he would win the 1932 election.
right,
So
right,
he felt that strongly about the fact that Americans wanted deposit insurance. And
and
he argued, and he gambled that, and he put it in the House bill, and he gambled that Roosevelt would never, ever veto that prize piece of
right.
legislation just because it had the FDIC in it.
Well, and that's where the Glass-Steagall Act comes in, right? Because Roosevelt was afraid if you insured everybody's deposits, banks would just take this money and gamble wildly with it,
As they had during the 20s,
as they
right?
had, but they couldn't with Glass-Steagall because that
Right.
separated out the investment and the savings part of the bank. So it all worked
It did.
together.
Another little known facet of the Glass-Steagall Act is that was actually the brainchild of the man that Roosevelt, as governor of New York, brought
Mhm.
in as his banking superintendent,
Yeah,
Joseph Broderick.
yeah,
Broderick tried out a version of Glass-Steagall in
yeah.
New York state banking regulations and
Mm.
testified before a hearing led by Carter Glass, the
Yeah, yes,
powerful
Senator.
Virginia
Yeah,
senator whose
yeah.
name is part of the Glass-Steagall Act. Glass had never even considered this kind of deposit taking securities issuing division
Right.
before until Broderick testified about it.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
lo and behold, added it to the bill. So Roosevelt, in a way, was actually the godfather of Glass-Steagall as well.
And it's amazing too how much Americans really came to participate in the financial markets, not just the banks. It's a amazing figure that John Kenneth Galbraith had in his book about the 1929 crash, saying that for all we think about it, oh, everyone was in the market. He looks through the numbers and feels that at most 1.5 million people out of 120 million Americans at the time, I mean a little more than 1%, had an active association of any sort with the stock market at the time of the crash, and fewer than 1 million of these people were active speculators. So it was really something about you just didn't put your money on Wall Street, period. No 401ks, no mutual fund, nothing, we have mutual funds, but the average person was very leery of
Yeah.
having anything to do with Wall Street.
You did have mutual funds, but they were
Yeah,
so
you did have
poorly
mutual funds. Yeah.
regulated that they were the
Yes.
brokers' private piggy banks. And there
Yes.
were a
Yeah.
number of fund scandals that arose in these days. But yeah, it was I think the the notion that Americans would be active in the stock market was became a kind of a jazz age trope. I mean, the idea of
Yeah.
the shoe shine boy with
Yes.
stock
Yeah.
tips and that everybody is the variety headline, Wall Street lays an egg, gave
Yes.
the
Yeah.
impression that everybody and his brother
Uh-huh.
was involved in the stock
Mhm.
market in the 1920s. And that, as you point out so wisely,
Yeah.
simply was not true. People
No.
followed the news. It was
Yeah.
entertainment. It was games. There were celebrities. Many of the big stock speculators were celebrities in the way that Elon Musk or even Warren Buffett
Yes.
are
Yeah.
celebrities today. But that didn't mean that people actually had their own skin in the game.
Or the way Bonnie and Clyde became celebrities
Yes.
shortly afterwards.
Right.
So, and this was quite a fight against Wall Street, as you show. Really just completely opposed by so many of the leaders of the stock exchange, which was starting to change, as you show in your book. People were starting to get wise. Hey, maybe it's good to have a well-regulated market.
Yeah.
But the big guy who they have to overcome is the president of the exchange at the start of the New Deal, and he's somebody who inadvertently helps a lot of these reforms go through. Do you want to
Uh,
tell us a little
yeah.
about Dickie Whitney as
A
Roosevelt?
novelist couldn't have invented Richard Whitney. I mean, he's one of the four people whose stories I build Taming the
Yeah.
Street around. He was the antiphon to Roosevelt, Joseph Kennedy, and William O. Douglas, who were pushing for these reforms.
Yeah.
He was a
Yeah.
Boston-born patrician. His older
Yeah.
brother was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, then as now an immensely powerful and influential firm. He lived like a grandee. I mean, like a British
Yeah.
foxhounds and yachts and thoroughbred horses. And when he was doing battle against the New Deal, he was one of the most admired, respected figures in American finance. He consorted with senators and corporate titans. The financial media sadly took his word as law, rarely questioned anything he said, unfortunately. So no one knew at the time that the New Deal battles were really being joined how corrupt he was. But he was corrupt to the core. He was an embezzler. He was stealing from his client accounts from as early as the late 1920s. And he was that secret he kept until he was exposed in March of 1938 in an immense earthquake on Wall Street. It was such a shock that Richard Whitney was exposed as this not just a failed broker, but a crooked broker.
He had also embezzled from the Widows and Orphans Fund on
At
Wall
the
Street.
He
And
did at the New York Stock Exchange's Widows and Orphans Fund.
And even more shockingly, from the New York Yacht Club. He had embezzled from the New York Yacht Club,
he did
which he was an
indeed.
officer of.
He did
He stole
indeed.
from everybody and went to prison for it.
He
in
did.
the
I
end.
mean, I have a friend who very carefully points out that Richard Whitney is the only president of the New York Stock Exchange to go to Sing Sing so far.
That's great. He's yeah, it was quite something. William Manchester is a great little passage where he writes about how the other inmates there always called him Mr. Whitney, and they would be sure to let him get a base hit in the prison yard games. That they knew how to treat a gentleman in
And
those days.
such was his celebrity, the local tabloids actually reported on those prison baseball games. I mean, so if Whitney got a hit,
it must have been like following the Joe DiMaggio hitting streak.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite an incredible fight. And Noah, you have in your fascinating article about how this new administration was going to come in and do these things, how it was going to make these massive changes in pretty much all parts of American life. You have some great statistics here about how the Congress created over 60 new agencies between March of 1933, when Roosevelt took the oath of office, and July of 1934, and how this required 348 interdepartmental committees to coordinate and implement policy as the government grew by something like, what was it, like 50% just in this quick time. It's amazing they were able to coordinate it and do so much. But something more had to be done. So there's a president's committee on administrative management that's appointed to try to find a way to make this amazing expansion run smoother. And you note how many advocates of the current right-wing idea of the unitary executive, which would give all executive power to the president, apparently suspended while the Supreme Court tries to grab all executive power, but how a lot of people who advocate for the unitary executive cite this committee, but in fact, the committee was really driven by something entirely different, really to try to check world fascism at the time.
Yeah, it's a complicated story. Thank you for your kind words about the piece. I do just have to give some credit. The statistics I think I got from Matthew Dickinson, who's a wonderful political scientist at Middlebury. He's got a great book called Bitter Harvest about some of the ways that Roosevelt managed this. But no, you're exactly right. And it sort of picks up where Diana left off, which is if you imagine coming into government with this non-functional banking sector, right, and how debilitating that is. You can't have an economic life if you don't have a functional banking sector, at least in a capitalist system. And that's just the beginning. Everything is downstream from that. And so in those first days, famously, Roosevelt is throwing lots of things at the wall and trying to figure out what will stick. And Congress gives him this huge assist when they start allocating massive monies. I was going to say billions of dollars, but that number doesn't quite capture it for us because it's really about the fraction of all government expenditures that are now being given to the federal government to spend, which is a totally different posture. Think about the Republican presidents of the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge with his obsession with getting the reparations money back from Europe. They hired the money, didn't they? When Taft and Roosevelt are thinking about Teddy Roosevelt and his successor Taft, when they're thinking about the executive branch, they're thinking about shrinking it and saving money. The first head of the Bureau of the Budget under Warren Harding, his charge is to cut expenditures across the board by 5% or maybe 10%. It might even be Charles Dawes. Okay, but enter Franklin Roosevelt in this Great Depression moment, and it's the opposite. It's, wait, we have to solve these problems. That's going to require spending on a heroic scale, and how do we do it? So they are standing up institutions on the fly. Now, you can see why if you're a strong presidentialist, the fact that this is happening under Franklin Roosevelt, that Roosevelt is so beloved, and that he's got his hands in a lot of it, might make you look to this as a model for strong presidentialism. But it seems to me that there's a critical difference, which is that especially as we get further into the 1930s and the New Dealers are more and more aware of the dangers of unchecked, consolidated power, they, even the New Dealers, start to think about, wait, how can we make sure that the system remains not just efficacious, but also democratic? And so I think it's, while there are some people in the New Deal orbit who are enamored of Mussolini in particular, so I think Hugh Johnson, the National Industrial Recovery Act is kind of the most classic example. And obviously the NIRA is modeled in critical ways on the Statuto Nuovo, right? Corporatism is not the main New Deal project. And again, this is where Diana's work is just so critical, right? We see these reforms that Diana was telling us about. They're not about turning American finance into an extension of the government or to trying to broker finance through the government. Rather, just as Diana said, it's about making sure that finance remains in private hands, but just safe for the American people. And that New Deal impulse, something like, let's check authoritarian power while allowing for the market and liberal freedoms to flourish, you see that same impulse even in how they're thinking about the organization of the executive branch. So the committee you referenced, the President's Committee on Administrative Management, it's a bunch of public administration types from the 20s and early 30s who put themselves to thinking about, well, how are we going to run this government that's now doing all these things? And the model that's lying to hand is the fascist model, which says, let's turn the state into an extension of the personality of the chief executive. And there's actually that's not my line, that's the line of this Hungarian fascist named Zoltán Hajáry, who gets into dialogue with some New Dealers at a conference in the late 30s. And the New Dealers, Louis Brownlow, Charles Merriam, they recoil when they hear that. They say, no. The government is not the personality of the chief executive. The Budget Bureau, which is the agency that's the most responsive to the president at that time, it's not the president's analysts any more than the Department of Justice is the president's lawyers. They're the lawyers for the United States. They're the Department of Justice for the United States. They're the Bureau of the Budget for the United States. And the president is the president of the United States, who has these responsibilities under law. So let's make sure that the president has the power to execute the laws and fulfill his constitutional responsibilities.
Right.
But that does not mean that we turn the government into an extension of his personality. And in fact, if there was a chance that would happen, we'd have to guard against it because that would be fascism. And so if you want to understand everything from the design of the comptroller general, the officer in the government who's responsible for auditing accounts, we can talk more about that. Roosevelt did a couple of run-ins with him, to the Administrative Procedure Act, which is at the root of those cases you and I were talking about before, right? When Loper Bright rules that Chevron is unconstitutional, it does it relying on the Administrative Procedure Act, but the roots of the Administrative Procedure Act are found in Robert Jackson's report on administration, Robert Jackson being Roosevelt's Attorney General, and before that Solicitor General. They go right back to the New Deal and to this idea that you're going to make efficacious and accountable government, which means you're not going to have this personalist presidentialism.
And it's amazing. And as you're right, it's amazing how primitive American government was before. It's we don't really kind of understand this, but as you write, and again, the piece is the anti-fascist roots of presidential administration. As you write, really, the President's Committee on Administrative Management, which almost unknown today in America, but it envisioned modern, these are your words, envisioned modern presidential administration and wrote the words that brought it into being. This is really sort of this moment. And you have a great description of how they were learning this when they were actually over in Europe. Visiting in Germany and in Poland, they call it the Battle of Warsaw, talking to Europeans how, okay, what are we going to do to deal with this depression? And hearing from the fascists, as if they were just another point of view. Oh yeah, just give everything to Hitler or give everything to whoever the local fascist dictator is, and he'll do it all. Yeah,
it should be noted that Mussolini had a large following on Wall Street as well, and in corporate America. In fact, Thomas Lamont, who was the managing partner of J.P. Morgan during the years that Dick Whitney's brother was his right-hand man, had an autographed picture of Mussolini hanging in his office. And J.P. Morgan underwrote a number of the Italian government bonds that were traded on Wall Street. So the efficiency of the fascist model, particularly in Italy. Now, Mussolini came to power a decade before Hitler did. And so he was what Wall Street thought of as fascist government, and the old cliche about he made the trains run on time.
Right.
I mean, they saw that as a contrast, the Italian economy as a contrast to the chaos in the Great Depression that the U.S. was experiencing. So Wall Street, it as well had its longings for a strong man. And in fact, the time Roosevelt was sworn in, Walter Lippmann, this powerful public intellect, took him aside in a private conversation and said that, he was afraid that Roosevelt would just have no choice but to become a dictator. In order to pull us out of the Depression.
No, just to piggyback on Diana's point, like Barron's Business Magazine, right, in 38 or something, no, 32 is calling for a mild dictatorship as a solution.
There was actually a car, the Dictator, that was a popular model, really, that came out in the 30s. It was this was another funny note. Well, a couple of funny things about Mussolini. One, as I understand it, the trains really didn't run on time. He just stripped all the local routes of cars and put them on the main trunk routes that other foreign tourists would be on. Um, and two, another proof of how much Americans admired Mussolini. Tony Lazzari, the Hall of Fame second baseman for the Yankees during this period, was routinely called the Mussolini of the Diamond in tribute in New York newspapers.
Yeah.
You know,
And it wasn't just Mussolini. I mean, there's a wonderful chapter in Ira Katznelson's book, Fear Itself, where he reconstructs the fascist air marshal's arrival in Chicago.
Oh, yeah. Italo Balbo, right?
You got it, right. So it's
Yeah.
so important to go both year by year and sort of like community by community. But this is why I get so impatient with the Jonah Goldbergs of the world and the others who say, oh, look, the New Dealers, they're all just fascist sympathizers. Because in fact, it's just as Diana's suggesting, it's the opposite, right? You actually have a widespread fascination among some Americans with versions of fascism, concentrated in actually places of power. Even major anti-fascist liberals, like a Nicholas Murray Butler, who's an anti-Semite and all sorts of other things, is talking about Mussolini as somebody you have to wrestle with. And for many of the New Dealers, the challenge is precisely, how do you do democracy? How do you do capitalism in this moment when alternative models are surging and appealing? And those alternative models are more controlling, more authoritarian, more corporatist. And so I think the right way to understand some of these reforms, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, like the President's Committee on Administrative Management's Executive Reorganization Acts, it's genuinely seeking a kind of alternative to what people assume is the answer, which would be, oh yeah, just execute all these people and nationalize or something to that.
Right. And we should start wrapping up soon so we can get some questions in. But yeah, and it strikes me as a key to both Roosevelt and the New Deal that these solutions were at times improvised, at times just kind of makeshift, but always in that sense. And this is the best part about New Deal liberalism, American liberalism in general. Acknowledging that things change, that these are human beings you're dealing with, that there are no grand solutions. There's no, all these kind of grandiose ideas coming from fascism, and communism, and laissez-faire capitalism. Just put this extreme philosophy in, and everything will run fine, and it will be the end of the state, and we'll all live happily ever after. That was something rejected in these plans. Lots of checks and balances. We go forward. We have all these, I think both separation of powers internally. You mentioned as well as between Congress and, but
I was going to say, I'd be curious what Diana's take is on this, because there's a big debate in the New Deal historiography about how much was improvisation, how much of it was planned, and go ahead.
I have a strong view of that.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. What is it?
I push back strongly, as does Eric Rauschway, whose work I admire so much on the New Deal, against the idea that the New Deal was improvisation. It was just a bunch of college professors. Let's make a show. In fact, if you look at Roosevelt's campaign speeches, and I'm speaking now specifically about his financial reforms.
Right.
If you look at what he told people he was going to do, and then you look at what he did. He did it. He told. In fact, there was a list on the front page of the New York Times after one of his campaign speeches that detailed precisely what he expected to do to regulate public utilities, down to the point of demanding that they publicize their profit and loss statement. That's how detailed it was. He said he was going to regulate stock exchanges. He said he was going to regulate banks. He told people what he was going to do. And Hoover knew he was going to regulate Wall Street. Wall Street knew he was going to regulate Wall Street, and the voters knew he was going to regulate Wall Street. So the idea that he just came in March of 1933 and said, "Gee, what should we do? Oh, we could regulate Wall Street." I mean, that's absurd. It's absolutely
right.
I'm so glad. No, I'm so glad to hear it, because I have the same feeling. And I suspect that some of the emphasis on improvisation was part of this moment in the 50s and 60s with the emphasis on the vital center, consensus historiography. There's often a desire to sort of make the New Deal seem less radical and also less confrontational. And I assume part of that is about like the long con, about making us think that, oh, there's nothing to see here. And so don't worry your pretty little heads about massive inequalities of wealth. We can make egalitarian change in America without having to really offend anybody. And I think part of what Diana's reminding us is that nobody believed that at the time. People knew that you were going to have a serious political battle. And from my own little corner of the world, in the public administration side, even if Roosevelt doesn't come in knowing exactly what he's going to do, you've got a generation of people who are thinking creatively about these problems in public administration. And those are the folks who come in. And so
and people that he's pulling in from all over. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, he did. And even more importantly, he made it clear what he was going to do. He started right away to do it. And while you can argue that, I mean, he spoke in every campaign stop. If you read his campaign speeches and platform statements through the 32 race, as I did, you can see how specifically. But then he came into office and he did it. And what happened in 1936? He runs for re-election and wins every state except 2. So I think we can say that he told them what he was going to do. He came in and he did it, and they said, do that some more. Give us some more of that. So I think that to argue that this was an ad hoc, improvised, sort of taken on the fly, it ignores the historical evidence, and more so, I think the radicalness of it, how dramatic a change it was, is reflected by how much ordinary Americans got behind it. The extent to which they saw this as a revolution in their lives. Banks didn't fail. Mutual funds could be trusted. You could save. You could get electricity that you could afford. You could. So average Americans knew that this had worked. I mean, in fact, because it's widely known, it was expected that Roosevelt would not win in 1936.
With the Liberty.
All of the famous pollsters saying that it would be very close.
Literary Digest.
It would be very close. But Arthur Kroc, who was the political correspondent for the New York Times, noticed that on the campaign train, which is how Roosevelt campaigned, people would line up along the railroad tracks out in the hinterland, blistering hot days through that summer, just to get a glimpse of Roosevelt through the train car windows as he went past. And Kroc quite wisely understood that there was a connection between the ordinary American and this candidate that he had never seen before. So I think we have to, if it scares people that the New Deal was so radical and so confrontational, they should take comfort in the fact that for the Americans whose lives it changed, they deeply applauded it.
Extraordinarily. Let's get to some questions here. But it's a very good point, and I think people who don't understand how life was beforehand in America. The 19th century was not a time when all the money came from tariffs and nobody paid taxes and life
and the poverty rate was more than 40%.
Our days were filled with wonder. Constant bank failures, constant depressions. All right, let's go to some Q&A here. Let's see. If I am understanding this correctly, is there another irony to all of this shift to the courts to be the main deciding factor? Is that it is helping in battling the current extreme government overstep? I think maybe that is being addressed now in the presentation, but seems like a troubling and odd situation that is also a possible silver lining. How does everybody feel about that? Are the courts going to save us, or
I'm going to defer to Noah on that.
There's the
worse.
Historian way of thinking about it and the law professor way of thinking about it. I think the historian way of thinking about it is to say, the courts have pretty rarely been allies of social democratic change, and nobody understood that better than the New Dealers, right? If you think about, think if you're coming of age in the 1920s and 30s. You've got the legacy of the Reconstruction amendments in your background. And what's the one thing you know? Well, there was a whole war. They amended the Constitution, and then the judges turned these amendments into provisions that mostly protect corporations, not racial egalitarianism. And so I think the New Dealers understand that if you want to control the law, it's not enough to write law or amend the Constitution. You need to control the judges. And of course, the judges are in the way of New Deal reform, leading to the famous, court packing plan. And we can fight about the switch in time and how much of a difference it makes. But what is critical is that over the course of the next years, the New Deal coalition does remake the courts. Now, fast forward to today, and this is where the law professor answer starts to come in. So we're living in an era in which anti-New Dealers have mostly remade the courts, right? Starting with Reagan, the number of Supreme Court justices, they've all been appointed by Republicans. Okay, not all, but more or less. And strong anti-New Deal provisions. The lower courts are dominated by non-New Dealers. But those judges, whether they're New Dealers or anti-New Dealers, tend to be committed to pretty boring rule of law propositions.
Right.
And so if you're worried about what Donald Trump is doing right now, there's a nice, there's some comfort in the fact that while Donald Trump doesn't think he has a responsibility to uphold the Constitution and has put together an administration that is contemptuous of the rule of law, the judges, even conservative judges, even anti-New Deal judges, tend to believe in the rule of law and the Constitution. But this, I think, should also be pretty sobering, right? Because it tells us that even if the judges are able to do what they can, and remember, this administration is now threatening to attack judges, even if the judges can do what they can, that might not get you beyond just the rule of law and the Constitution. And to go back to what Kevin was just reminding us of, the 19th century had the rule of law and the Constitution. The rule of law and the Constitution entitles the rich man just as much as the poor man to die of polio under a bridge in the cold, which is not exactly the vision of social democracy for the richest nation in the history of the world.
That is very true. A gentleman from Connecticut writes in to ask how much of what has happened in the past 100 days is an attempt to dismantle everything you've discussed this evening. Is there any method in the madness, or is it just talk about improvisation?
Well, to me, there's less method than there was in Trump's first term. I mean, in his first term, he made quite a thing in his second State of the Union talk about having erased more regulation than any administration in the history of the world. The Brookings Institute kept track, actually, of his deregulatory work, and he was pretty close to right. He made a specific effort to deregulate, as conservative administrations always have. Deregulation never dies. We can't drive a stake in its heart. It just constantly rises up out of the grave. However many times it fails us. But yes, to some extent, I think this new 100 days is an effort to both capture the dynamic quality of FDR's 100 days, but harness it to the demolition of much of what FDR envisioned as the proper role of government in regulating capitalism in the general interest. Nothing that the Trump administration has done has made capitalism safer for ordinary Americans. Nothing.
That's
so I mean, whether it's less safe food, whether it's less safe medicine, whether it's less well-regulated financial markets, riskier banks, whether all of that is by design. None of it has made capitalism safer or more congenial to the lives of average Americans. So it is kind of it's the antimatter of the 100 days. It's the mirror image.
That's a great way to put it, Diana. And you in your book, you mentioned how in the time since the New Deal, when the SEC was run by some real giants, both great minds and wily, very canny minds, Joe Kennedy and Jim Landis and William O. Douglas, major figures in American history. And since then, it's often been neglected, starved of funds, not allowed to look into certain things. And whenever that happens, you write, whether in 1987 with the Black Monday derivatives crash, which almost crippled the New York Stock Exchange, with the savings and loan scandal Enron in 2001, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008 that just sent shockwaves around the world. Whenever that happens, bad things ensue. So just to answer the original question of this, have we greatly increased the chances of the next Wall Street crash or next financial markets crash?
Yeah. To me, what the scariest thing about what Trump is doing is what he hasn't done. It's true that we do keep repeating this cycle of deregulate, fraud explodes, investors suffer and complain, regulation tries to catch up again, and rinse and repeat. We just sort of do that over and over again. But I don't think it's because we have such short attention spans. I think it is, in fact, kind of paradoxically, because we have so much faith in Roosevelt's rules. We don't really remember. What we don't remember is the 29 crash and the financial chaos and devastation that accompanied it. And so we don't really appreciate how bad it can be without regulation.
I wonder about that a lot. I think maybe combined with the rise of electronic media, kind of this imposed culture, which is just pervasive now. I wonder if only unconsciously Americans have come to believe we're watching a TV show and we don't really think anything can go that wrong.
Yeah, I think that's partly it. But I just want to point out too, as our title is looking at the next crash, we need to distinguish between, and I'm putting my financial reporter hat on here, between a stock market that falls and a stock market that falls apart.
Yes, that's good.
A lot of the things that Trump is doing in terms of tariffs, in terms of economic restrictions, in terms of uncertainty, will almost certainly make the market fall. It has already done so. What worries me is that one additional extraneous shock, whether it comes out of a cryptocurrency collapse or whether it comes out of a huge supply chain shocks that were unanticipated, that an extraneous shock will crack the infrastructure of the market, that the market will start to fall apart. And what I don't see in the Trump administration, and what I would like to see, is cool heads and a lot of expertise in the key financial decision makers at Treasury, at the Fed, and in the government overall. I'd like to see people in those jobs who have safely navigated a financial crisis, and I don't see those. So that worries me more than the ups and downs of the stock market.
You don't trust a bunch of Silicon Valley teenagers? I mean, Noah, just to give you the last word here, you wrote that we have to wrap up, unfortunately. This has been a wonderful talk. Great talking with both of you. Noah, you wrote that how the New Deal foundations of presidential administration have held, despite many times when it seems like it hasn't, and modern presidential administration was born anti-fascist. And you talk about devising an anti-fascist litmus test for government. How is that looking now? Are we close to fascism as well as cracking?
Oh, I think, I mean, the litmus test really was just about this question of the personality of the chief executive, and we see Trump treating the government as his personal fiefdom. So I think that in a very technical sense, we're clearly in a fascist government, and our fascist leaders are interested in all kinds of fascist programs. I think, to me, there's another sort of burden that gets put on us with that, which is if you think about the New Dealers and where they were before the first crash, right? They were trying to figure things out and imagine a world that would be robust in the ways that they were able to affect afterwards. And so maybe to try to, put a task before us, I think the next great crash is undoubtedly, as Diana's suggesting, becoming more likely. And that puts a burden on folks who take the New Deal seriously to start imagining the world that you would build afterwards to try to make it robust again.
Right. Let's hope that world is there to be rebuilt. Well, thank you so much. This was absolutely terrific. Diana B. Henriques, Noah Rosenblum. So come take a look at the Living New Deal website, livingnewdeal.org. Let us know what you think. Write us about any New Deal sites where you live. come join our local chapters and our discussions. It's all free. Though we would not be upset if you chose to be a donor. We accept all donations that are not in nefarious cryptocurrencies. So thank you very much for attending tonight, and you can get a recorded version of this on our website in a few days. Thanks so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.